I don't want my brother to visit me anymore. I still remember that night when we were kids and lying down in our beds at 1 a.m. without being able to sleep. We made a pact. The one that died first would make every possible attempt to come back and tell the other one what happens after you die. And no matter what it could cost us, we will return. It was something we would remind ourselves from time to time during our time together. Me and my brother were always very close to the point that people would think we were twins. We dressed the same and be together all the time. And something strange we developed was that we would always know what the other one was thinking or what he was going to say next. Something that I guess is normal when people spend that much time together. Tragedy came to our family some years later when my brother passed away because of a car accident. And I felt in a way like my life, or at least a big part of myself, was also gone. Never before did I felt this type of overwhelming loneliness, because he was someone I thought I would always had with me, and in just an instant, he stopped existing. That night during the wake, I remembered our agreement, but I didn't give it that much importance, as it was just something I remembered fondly. I got close to the casket to say my goodbyes, and I wished him well. And if there is anything after this life, then he would enjoy it. The next days were difficult for me, because the emptiness is something you can't explain, but you can feel it in with you. Years passed, and life keeps moving on, and even though sometimes I would remember him, the more time it passed, the less he was present in my mind. Life just keeps substituting dead people, and even the feelings start to go away from our memories. I remember the first time it happened. I couldn't sleep that night, so I just stayed there in my bed alone with the lights already turned off. But my eyes opened, and I started to get that feeling that someone is watching you. A feeling I can't explain, but we all have had it at some point. I was scared without knowing exactly why, and I felt my heartbeat getting faster and faster. I heard some steps on the next room, and I hesitated for a second, but I assured to myself that the outside door was locked, so I looked around and noticed how the mirror in the wall was fully black, like if it had been painted, so that no reflection could come from it. At that moment, I heard how the steps were getting closer and closer to my bedroom door, and slowly the door started to get open, like if I was being opened with precaution. I didn't have any time to have a reaction, so I just stayed frozen in the bed, waiting and wishing everything was just my imagination. I wanted to know who was outside my door, and when the door fully opened, I was shocked. It was him, my brother, in the same form as I last saw him many years ago. Like if time didn't pass for him, he entered the room, and when our eyes crossed, he gave me a big smile. Even though it was a big smile, I knew him enough to realize there was no real happiness behind that smile. He walked into the room and sat down in a chair and stared at me with his big fake smile. He seemed happy in a way, like if he had finally fulfilled his promise of returning after so many years. And I must accept that, after my initial scare at that moment, seeing him in front of me again made me feel so much happiness. I didn't have to say anything because I knew that smiled and what it meant, so I sat down in the corner of my bed enjoying the moment with him, finally being together again just like we had planned many years ago. Neither of us made any attempt to communicate with each other because it was as if the both of us knew what was happening. And soon after, he stood up and walked straight into a corner of the room that was the darkest area of the room, and he went into the shadows and disappeared. That night, I couldn't sleep, remembering all the time we had spent together, and had this feeling of security, like if I had realized that I was not alone in this world anymore, since my brother was still with me, and I didn't know if I would see him again. But I knew he was watching me. Years passed, and it sounds strange, but I had almost forgotten the event, and I must admit that a part of me always felt that it was just a dream. My life had changed a lot during this time. I got married and divorced, and in the middle part had a son that now took most of my time when he was with me, and it was around this time that he came back. I had days without being able to have a good night's sleep, and I started to feel like someone was watching me during my restless nights lying in bed. And I would say to myself that it was just insomniac paranoia to keep myself calm, but deep down I knew what was coming. That night, while I was trying to fall asleep, But had my eyes wide open, I saw this movement outside my window that I couldn't see exactly what it was because of the drapes being closed. But it was a big object that suddenly stopped in front of the window. I was in an almost unconscious state, like when you're about to fall asleep and can't move anymore, but you're still hearing clearly what is happening. I was about to get up from my bed when I saw this light coming into my room from the window, and it move inside until it touched a mirror. There was this hitting sound on the mirror glass, like if it had been touched by a coin, and that took me out of my semi-unconscious state. I looked around, but I didn't see anything different until I realized that the mirror was not reflecting anymore, and it was only showing solid black color. I felt again his stare on my back, so I turned around, and I could see him between the shadows of the dark corner. He spoke, and I noticed that his tone had changed to a more low tone, like a more mature voice, even though his pauses and rhythm was the same as I remember him. "Help me," he said without doing any movement, as if his image was just a memory of mine, but he might not actually be there. His tone was soft and calm, but there was some desperation in it. "It is cold here, and it is always dark." The room was extremely silent, like if time had froze, and there was no sound of any kind being produced at that moment. I started walking towards the darkness of the room when I heard my son crying, and his sound made me come out of this state of isolation, feeling like if all of a sudden I was in control again, and I found myself standing, but didn't remember exactly why I was there. So I turned the lights on and didn't saw anything out of place. I went to the crib and picked up my son and hold him until he fell asleep again, so I lay him down and turned the lights off. I returned to my bed and immediately the feeling of being watched returned, so I closed my eyes trying to forget everything when I heard this very soft murmur my way. "I want to rest now." I felt like if he was talking just in front of my face, and I could even feel his warm breath touching my skin. I wanted to believe I was just dreaming and kept my eyes closed. "I need your help. Can you help me?" Almost as a reflex, I moved my head affirmatively and I opened my eyes, but I couldn't see anyone in the room, so I closed them again. Remember when we used to play in the backyard of our grandma's house? That time when we decided to hide, and it took our parents hours to find us. How angry they were and said they had almost called the cops to notify we had been taken. I felt how my brain got filled of satisfaction for an instant by him sharing with me this moment we had lived together so much time ago, and I felt such joy of having him back again with me. Without opening my eyes, I responded, "Do you remember that Christmas night when we decided to secretly open our gifts days in advance, just to see what every box had inside? How our stupid little cousin found out and got us punished the whole season." I heard his laugh again, just as I remembered it with the same innocence that he still had, and I felt this profound relief, because I was sure now he was my brother back with me. "I need your help fast. Put this coin under your son while he is sleeping." What he asked scared me, and I immediately opened my eyes, and for my surprise there was an old coin over the blanket. It was heavily used but had no identifiers. Just a round piece of old metal, and I did not understood what was happening, so I quickly turned the lights on and looked around the room, focusing on the crib where my son was still sleeping. I thought if I should put the coin beneath him, just to help my brother because I knew him too well and knew he wouldn't dare hurt my son. He sounded so desperate, but I decided not to do it and turned the lights off. "You are not going to help me?" He asked me in a very saddened tone, but from there on he started to sound angry and accusatory. "I'm here because of you, because of your idea, and now I can't go back now, they are following me." I did not understand anything. Who could be looking for him and for what reason? Who or what was he running from? I decided not to say anything and just kept my eyes closed. He was now yelling at me, and I felt his breath crushing against my face, like if he was just in front of me. "I need him. Give him to me. They are looking to me, and they will find me. I was not supposed to come back." I kept my eyes closed, and his voice just disappeared after that. Some weeks had passed when he returned. I was in my bed with my son sleeping in his crib next to me. And since that last encounter, I really wished all of it was just my imagination and that it would never happen again. I turned off the lights, and immediately I could see a dark silhouette sitting on the corner sofa. The night lights from the city entered the room through the window, and in that almost full darkness, I could see his eyes reflecting the light, making them the only visible thing in the corner. I got scared when I saw that figure, and those shining eyes moving slowly from one side to another until they finally stood still, focusing on me. I turned the lights on, and there he was again, but he was different. Even though I recognized him quickly, he was also older at an age he never got to be alive. Our eyes looked at each other, and he smiled at me, and just after that, his eyes started to wander again, looking at the room. I tried to get up of my bed, but I felt very dizzy and almost fell. And in those movements, trying not to go down to the floor, I knocked off a glass of water that was next to my bed, and I realized how the water started to go from the cup up to the ceiling, drop by drop. As I lay down on the bed. He didn't move at all, like if he was stuck on that chair. He started talking to me without looking at me. He asked me if I remember past events we had together when we were children, and he seemed to remember very clearly all these events. But there was something unsettling in how he spoke without any emotion or expression. Everything spoken in the same monotonous tone without looking at me, only moving his eyes but not knowing where to lock his eyes to. I need your help, brother. Something was really off this time, so I just stayed quiet. Help me, you only have to repeat after me. I got scared seeing how his eyes were now completely black, and he started saying things in a language I did not understand. If he was in problems, I wanted to help him in any way, so I started repeating the noises he was making until I decided to stop doing this since I had no idea of the consequences. Brother, do not be afraid. I will never hurt you. He said this in a completely different voice, like if he was a different person now. Just repeat after me, is from the Bible. It will help me finally get some rest. I completely stopped in horror when I saw how a group of people had now appeared in the room standing next to him. They were all dressed in different styles of clothing and seemed to be of different ages. I still felt very weak, and I felt I couldn't distinguish what was real and what could I just be hallucinating, so I closed my eyes for what it felt like a second. But when I opened them again, I saw my brother had stood from the chair and was moving directly to the crib and looked at my son sleeping. Repeat after me, he told me. You have to hurry. They found me. I stayed quiet, since I had decided not to repeat anything because I didn't know anymore who or what he was. He had dropped to the floor like he had lost all his energy, but tried to crawl to me, and he was extending his arms trying to touch me, even though he was far away, that this was impossible, but he was doing it more like out of desperation. I could see his body for the first time, at least, what was visible through the darkness. This thin skeleton-like arm stretched, and his arm had almost no muscle on it, just bone, and I could see his pointy spine covered by his colorless and almost transparent skin. He looked up at me, and his face was very different from the face that I remembered, because he had this expression of fear, and like a reptile, following desperately his first prey in days, he moved violently, almost instinctively of survival towards me. His eyes were bigger and bulgier, almost too big for his skull. They were big and wide, completely open, looking at me and begging me with his look. You have to help me. He yelled at me. The people that were in the room with him had disappeared now. He kept asking for help, sounding more desperate every time he asked. Help me, help me. He was yelling, looking directly at me, stretching his hand, and I realized he was disappearing. If he was my brother, there was no way he could hurt me in any way, I thought, so I took the coin and put it below my son that was sleeping. I looked at my brother that was still on the floor, and I could see a smile in his face, a smile I couldn't interpret and never seen him do before. And then he just disappeared, going back into the darkness of the room. Time has passed, and I still remember his face of desperation. I have never seen someone looking like that. And sometimes when I look at my son, there is a part of me that can see him in there. But I now regret having done this, since I have seen my son also do that same smile that my brother did at the end. And I don't know if he was actually my brother, or if there is someone else in there now. The Devil of Laurel Branch. When I was a young girl, My dad always told me about the time when he was walking home on a late summer evening. The sun had just went down behind the mountain, blanketing the whole holler in darkness. This was not your typical darkness, but a darkness that was deep enough to feel. The type that made you feel like you were being suffocated. He was walking home with his father from his Aunt Bea's house. She always cooked Sunday dinner for the whole holler. Family or not, you were invited if you lived on Laurel Branch. You were considered family, even if you came from different blood. You were blood-bound by the branch. Every Sunday was filled with the laughter of his uncles and great-uncles as they sat together, huddled in the backyard shed. Cigarette smoke made the air hazy as their jokes lingered in it longer than they should. Sometimes, they would pass around a mason jar of shine from Old Opossum from the head of the holler. He wasn't kin, but he was family, like I said. The laughter wasn't the only sounds. It was sometimes drowned out by the angelic singing of Aunt Bea as she made cornbread with her daughter in the kitchen. Sometimes, as my dad played with the other kids, they couldn't keep themselves from running in the kitchen and pulling on Aunt Bea's apron for a quick crumble of the bread before supper. The scent that wafted through the open kitchen window was too enticing for them to ignore. This night was just like those nights that I described. Nothing out of the ordinary, except my dad's mama stayed at home to nurse his sister who had a cold. My dad and his father were not going to miss the mess of fresh squash that Aunt Bea was frying that night. His mama told them to go on. There wasn't nothing they could do. They'd just be bothering his sister coming in and out of the house. They'd just finished up listening to Great Uncle William's last story of the night. It of course ended in some dirty joke that caused him to laugh great big and throw back his knee. My dad was around 15 at this time, and this was the first time he was allowed to spend more than a minute in the shed. Most of the time, he was shooed out by a cigarette-gripped hand and told to go watch his cousins and sister. This time, he was welcomed. He'd even been allowed to get a tiny sup of the shine that Ole Opossum had just made. He was walking on air. He never felt so grown up before. His father gave one more wave to his sister and brother-in-law as they began the quarter-mile walk down to the home place. His father was the one to keep the old home place after the grandparents moved in with Aunt Bea to get extra care. They believed it should go to the eldest male, and he took it. He took good care of it, too. The little white house stayed spick and span, and the yard immaculate. As they walked, his dad loaded him down with the leftovers covered in tin foil that Aunt Bea had insisted they take to his mama and sister. He held the warm foil close to his chest as they went further and further into the belly of the holler. The home place was at the end of the holler, while Bea's was 2 houses down from the top. In between was a thick patch of forest, so dense that you couldn't see a star in the sky past the leaves. There was a branch that ran next to the road all the way down the holler that contained a giant boulder on its bank that they called Rabbit Rock. My dad had always called it Rabbit Rock, and his father did too. That's what that middle ground area was to them. His dad cut through the now pitch-black darkness by lighting up a hand-rolled cigarette. "Shoo, I'm stuffed," he said through the cigarette between his lips. "Me too," my dad replied. "Now don't be tellin' your mama that I let ye come in the shed for some moonshine ye hear?" he said as he let out a long breath of smoke. The only thing visible to him was the cherry of his cigarette glowing orange in the deep darkness. "I won't." "Better not, son." He lovingly slapped his shoulder and gave it a hearty squeeze. My dad felt like a man. He felt like he was growing up, and his father knew it. They could connect on a different level now. Something new. They both continued walking in a comfortable silence that was filled with katydids singing their summer song. The darkness was different tonight. The past few nights had been clear of clouds, so the light of the moon could cast a low glow that would slightly penetrate through the trees. This night was clouded, and no light could reach. It was as if an invisible dome that deflected light was placed over the holler, cutting them off from the light of the moon forever. My dad noticed this darkness as they slowly walked into the trees. It seemed to creep up on them like a slow sickness, kind of like the one his sister had right now. He suddenly lost any manliness that he had gained that night. This darkness made him a boy again. A boy who unspokenly walked a bit closer to his father. It felt significantly lonely walking being just the two of them. He was used to his mama and sister walking slightly behind them. Tonight, the only thing behind him was the crawling sensation on his back that signaled something might be following him. They trekked deeper into the wooded area, their boots kicking up dust on the dirt road. The further they went, the darker it got. It was to the point that they couldn't see their hand in front of their own faces. The only thing keeping them from running off the road was the familiar feel of the dirt road under their boots. I'm gonna go out in the tater patch tomorrow to do some weeding and to keep an eye on those tater bugs. They've been eating all over them plants. His dad said, breaking the silence. He puffed on his cigarette, the only light around, shining like a lightning bug. Speaking of lightning bugs, there weren't any. That was odd, and the deeper they went, the less they heard of the katydids. And their constant buzz. It was actually gone now. This made the chill climb higher up my daddy's spine. No light from the lightning bugs and no buzz from the katydids made the forest seem dark and devoid of all life. I'll come help ye, my dad replied, desperate for any noise. His father hummed as he continued to puff on his cigarette. What happened to them katydids? He asked, not able to hide his nervousness. They probably went to sleep, I guess. Your granddaddy used to say that a devil was passing through when it gets quiet like this. You think that's true? My dad immediately regretted saying this. He knew his father would never let him back in the shed since he believed in tall tales. Nah, not unless the devil is a bobcat. That's one thing that can make it this quiet. They continued to walk, but my dad kept that crawling on his back, convinced a bobcat was silently stalking them from behind. He would glance over his shoulder once in a while, but that didn't help any. It was so dark, it looked like staring into an oil pit. Thick. Dark. Nothing. Not even a shadow could be cast. They walked in their new silence, a silence that was too quiet and uncomfortable. Suddenly my dad's darkness was disturbed by a wall. No, not a wall. It was warm, hairy, and filthy. He had run face first into something moving, no walking, the opposite direction. The feeling of matted fur, or maybe even hair, remained on his skin for far too long after losing contact. The smell was the worst, however. It assaulted his nostrils with a pungent odor, a cross between feces and rotten eggs. Shh! It grumbled as it hit my dad. It seemed just as surprised as he did. The tinfoil leftovers of squash, beans, chicken livers, and cornbread crushed between them, letting a bit fall to the ground. In the blackness, his father was unsure of what happened, but felt the hair and smelled the stench of the thing brush past. This was enough to show him how much danger they had literally run into. This was no animal or human he had ever encountered before. Neither my dad or his had stopped walking during the whole ordeal. The only time they stopped was initial contact. Fear had propelled them both forward. The thing slid by and stopped at the dropped leftovers. It began eating with sickening and obscene noises. Both of them picked up their pace. What? My dad was cut off by his father saying, "Shh, keep walking." He did as he was told. He held the crumpled leftovers to his chest, the warm juices from the squash and beans seeping into his shirt. They both unspokenly increased their pace, almost to a light jog. They didn't want to draw any more attention to them since it was occupied. They got about 50 feet before they heard its slamming footsteps in the dirt behind them. It was coming towards them. Drop some leftovers behind you, his dad urged. What? Just do it. He did as he was told once again and threw a couple pieces of chicken behind him. The footsteps stopped and it began its stomach-churning eating again. They picked up their pace again and kept going down the road. They had almost made it through the wooded area and past Rabbit Rock. Another 50 feet had passed before they heard it running with an urgency. It sounded human, like 2 feet rushing upon them, like someone trying to attack. More! His dad yelled. He threw more chicken and some squash. His arm burned from how hard he threw, hoping to backtrack the beast. More ripping, tearing, and sucking filled their ears from behind. What was this thing? They were at the edge of the forest, almost out of the belly of the beast, they hoped. They could hear it smack its lips and grunt as it finished its last piece. More. Before it can catch up. His father urged again as they burst from out of the woods. He He fumbled with the foil and grabbed a handful of the mush that it had become. He stopped and slung it as far as he could. This time, with the little light that the uncovered night sky provided, he could see its eyes glow yellow as it stared into his. The eyes jumped from the ground about 7 or 8 feet up as it began to sprint towards the leftovers. My dad felt a primal fear that only his most ancient ancestors could have felt as he yelled, "Run!" They both ran as hard as they could, their boots creating clouds of dust behind them. He had never seen his father run, let alone like this. Heck, he had never seen him scared, but this was something that could scare the hardest and coldest of men. They ran until they saw the low glow of their porch light. My dad threw bits and pieces of the leftovers as they ran, the beast running and stopping, running and stopping. The sound, the smell, its eyes. Neither of them could stop thinking of it. Finally, they both crossed the threshold and up to the porch. They erupted inside and slammed the wooden door behind them. His mama stood up quickly from her rocking chair. "What in the daylights is going on?" she yelled, a horrified look on her face. "There's some kind of man or animal or something after us," his dad said breathlessly, his unlit cigarette butt still in between his lips. "What are you talking?" His mama was cut off by a loud growl outside. It was like a cross between an animal's guttural groan and a wild man's scream. Everyone looked towards the door. My dad felt his heartbeat quicken, and he held the smashed plate of food to his chest. "Mama," he whispered. That's when they heard it begin clawing and scratching at the foundation of the house. It began ripping and tearing the wood like the way its mouth destroyed the leftovers. "Mama!" he yelled, fear engulfing him completely. He didn't care if this wasn't how a man should act. He was a boy, and he would stay that way if it meant being brave in the face of things like this. His parents both looked at each other terrified. He'd never seen an emotion like this on their faces. He didn't know what scared him more, the beast or their faces. His mama ran to the back and grabbed his groggy sister into her arms and came back to put him to her chest. "Joseph, kill that thing," she yelled at his dad. "My little gun won't do a thing to it if it's ripping the house apart." It broke through the foundation and crawled under their floorboards. Beneath them, they could see the boards begin to lift and bend. Everyone was silent as they watched it hunt for food, sniffing loudly like a wild dog. Its stink seeped through the cracks of the floor, along with its long, stiff hair. It stuck through the cracks like a porcupine's quills. They watched in horror as the weak boards were the only thing between them and it. "What do we do?" his mama yelled at their dad. "I don't know." "Get your gun," she screamed. His father ran to the bedroom and returned with his shotgun in his shaking hands. "Shoot it," my dad screamed. He fired towards it, firing a hole through the floor. The beast let out an inhuman scream. His sister covered her ears and began to sob. His father fired again, another shriek erupting from beneath the floorboards. The beast began to slam itself into the floorboards repeatedly, its hair shooting through and its smell getting worse. Again, his mama screamed. He fired one final time. The beast bellowed in pain once more before it turned and scrambled out the way it came in, crying the whole way. My dad and his family stood there for quite a while, looking at the splintered floorboards, the bullet holes, wondering what just occurred in front of them. They had no words. They had no explanation. They just had fear. A fear far greater than anything they'd ever felt before. It was months before they were outside after dark again. They didn't even go to Aunt Bee's for at least a month. They were too afraid to go past Rabbit Rock into those woods. They couldn't risk another encounter with that thing. They inspected the prints outside their house the next day, but all that was there were boot prints. 3 sets of boot prints. Each one of their beliefs were altered that night. They never believed in monsters, devils, or haints, but that encounter solidified it for all of them. Everyone they told thought they just had a run-in with a bear and it was too dark to see, but they all knew this was far from a bear, bobcat, or any mountain animal they were used to. From that point on, they had a newfound respect for the forest, the mountain, and the nighttime. They knew they didn't belong out past dusk. Only creatures like that did. The world is about to end again. Y'all are gonna think I'm crazy, but what makes this time any different from every other time? I've been poor and I've been rich. I've assassinated officials, and I've worked in shelters and hospitals. I've been famous and infamous. I've been married to the same woman 763 times over now, and every time I've tried to change things. But now I'm just gonna write this. This is how I'll live out the last few weeks this time. I'm finally tired of trying to change things. I've just tried to live my own life this one time. I don't have a Groundhog Day, I've got a Groundhog life. Every time I'm born on September 1st, 1980 in Sand Gap, Kentucky, I always die the same day. We all do. I was lucky the first time out of the gate. Jess found me in Louisville. She's the angel that God sent to keep my sanity while I try over and over again to work out a problem that seemingly has no solution. She's the reason I keep going. Maybe someday I'll get to grow old with her. Hopefully someday I'll get it right. I decided this time, towards the end of this life, to just spend it with her at the lake. We've never been able to have kids. She's never wanted to adopt, so it's always just us. I'd never told her how many different times and lives we've had, until this one. I told her in January. I told her what's about to happen. I could tell that she was afraid that I was losing my mind. Who isn't nowadays? It took 2 weeks of me predicting things that came true around the world until she started to believe me. All things considered, she took the news of the end of time pretty well. She's sitting outside on the deck right now enjoying the evening, while I'm writing this and listening to my Oliver Anthony mix. I think I might just tell her every time from here on out. It felt good to get it off my chest. I had wanted to tell her so many times. Hundreds of lifetimes spent keeping what I know from my lobster. How many times am I going to have to watch that damn show? I told her that I'm not giving up. I'm going to keep trying to prevent it. But this one time, I just want to be with her. Maybe clear my mind. Figured I'd just put this out there, and maybe somebody else might have an idea. Maybe enough people might read this and wake up. I don't know. Division and hate is always more important than helping each other. Cries for war from the rich are always louder than the weak utterances of suffering from the poor. It's like this sickness was coded into the world's DNA from the beginning, and it always manifests itself right about now. And the only thing that destroys that fever is a hot war that kills the host, along with everything on it. Soon, my body will be born again, but the mind will stay. Back to square one, the problem will remain. How do I stop it? I'm the lone voice in the wilderness. Right before Christmas, the skies will fall in nuclear fire again, and those last few moments are always spent asking why. When the answer was always obvious. I'm not quitting. Eventually I'll find the solution in another lifetime, but this one just belongs to me and her. Jess is calling me now, so I'm going to sign off and enjoy some whiskey and fireflies with my girl. I'm going to be selfish this time. Catch y'all on the next go-round. My wife did something unspeakable. Mary and I have been married for the better part of a decade now. She is the love of my life, and I wouldn't trade her for anything. The only problem is, the woman who mothered my son is no longer here. I don't mean that in a literal sense. She is alive and well. At least, as well as who she can be, considering the recent trauma she's been through. About 3 weeks ago, she received terrible news from back home, one that shattered her entire existence. Her parents had died. It was some freak accident, carbon monoxide poisoning. The grief overtook her to the point that she could no longer function. I thought that she would get better after the funeral, but there she was, rocking back and forth in the corner of the living room. I tried to give her as much support as I could, but no matter what I did, I could not find a way to quell her pain. It finally got to the point that I feared leaving our 3-year-old with her. I needed to get her professional help. One day, when she seemed in better spirits, I decided to share some news with her. I had booked a therapy appointment at the local counseling center. As she looked at the living room's blank white wall, I pressed a hand on the middle of her back, jolting her out of whatever fascination she had with its white facade. "Honey?" I said in the sweetest tone I could muster. Surprisingly, she didn't spit fire into my face like the last few times I tried to speak with her. As her eyes looked at me from behind her puffy eyelids, she gave me the first genuine smile in a long time. "Hey you," she said, a loving way she so often addressed me. I took a seat next to her on the ground, crossing my legs as I gathered the courage to send her into an inevitable fury. I took a deep breath and spit out my confession. Honey, I'm really worried about you. My voice cracked as the words fought me on the way up. I want to help you, but no matter what I do, I can't find a way to take your pain away, I said as she tried to process what I was saying. To be honest, after seeing her blank expression, I was sure it was falling on deaf ears. That is, until her gaze dropped, and she opened her mouth, giving me a gut-wrenching response. No one can help me. Her response was monotone and cold. I've never seen anyone experience as many contradicting emotions as she did in that instance. Her eyes signaled sadness, her brows anger, and as she returned her stare to the wall, I swear I saw a sense of hopefulness. Only he can help me. I turned my gaze to whatever her eyes were glued to, but the wall's empty void did not instill confidence in my wife's sanity. I knew then that she was far beyond any help that I could render. I took her hands, grasping them with love. Honey? I questioned cautiously, but she did not return her gaze to me. Placing my hand under her chin and tilted her face back over to me, cautious, almost timid that she would chomp down on my fingers if I strayed too close. When her face was pointed towards me, but her eyes remained glued to the white walls, twisted, her irises half hidden behind the edges of her eye sockets, the sclera of her eyes webbed out with long, skinny streaks of blood vessels. No matter what I said to her now, it would not be registered. She had retreated into her state of extreme grief. My heart filled with dread, but for what it was worth, I was going to vent my concerns, even if they would go unacknowledged. So there's this doctor that was recommended to me by a friend, down at the counseling center. As expected, the words just decorated the air around her, but I pressed on anyway. He specializes in grief counseling, and I think he could help you. Once again, the words did not register, or so I thought until I saw her eye twitch. I took that as a sign of piqued interest. His name is Dr. Robinson. I know this is out of the blue, but I need to get you seen by a proper professional. You need help, honey. This isn't normal. Her eye gave another twitch, only I finally noticed that it wasn't her eye, but something swimming around behind the little blood vessels that gave the impression of an eye twitch. What the hell, I thought to myself, taking to my knees and inching my face closer to whatever was crawling inside her eye. Upon closer inspection, something wiggled in this grotesque fashion, burrowing a path through her eyeball. The little figure inside crested its tiny little head and began chewing towards the surface of her sclera. What the fuck? The little voice in my head said, trying to comprehend what it was seeing. A little white insect poked its head through the newly dug hole before it fell completely out of her eye like a fallen tear. It now lay on the fabric of her jeans, flopping about like a creepy crawler from hell. I pinched it with 2 fingers and held it up to the light. It was a maggot. I jumped back in disgust. Falling back onto my palms, the bug flung to some far-off corner of the room. In shock, my eyes were planted firmly on my wife. Just then my son called out, "Daddy?" This wasn't the time to indulge my son, so I returned a dismissive statement. "Not now, buddy," I responded in a shaky voice, still in shock of my wife's eye maggot. Retaking to my knees, I re-examined my wife's face. The little hole the maggot had crawled out of was no longer there. Regardless, I kept my eyes planted behind the little red blood vessels in anticipation of another wriggly figure swimming about. My wife suddenly darted her face towards mine at lightning speed, chomping her teeth onto my cheek. I felt my skin give way until the flesh freed itself from my identity. The shock of the ordeal made me wince in pain, forcing me to close my eyes. When they opened, my hand draped over my fresh wound. I held my palm out in front of me, examining the blood. "Daddy!" My son signaled his growing impatience. I ignored his whining, returning my eyes to Mary. A trail of blood dripped off her chin as the wall continued to hypnotize her. "Daddy! Can I eat this little jelly bean?" Tommy blurted out his question. "Yes. Yeah, whatever you want, buddy," I said. He returned with an excited, "Yay!" I sat there for a split second before the realization hit me. Little jelly bean? The fucking maggot! No, stop. I turned to see my son dropping the slithering insect down into his gullet. Running over to him, I clutched him by the cheeks, forcing his mouth ajar. "Spit it out," I commanded, And so he did. The maggot now lay in the center of my palm, its body cut in half by my son's milk teeth. "Aw, Dad," my son whined. "But Mommy lets me have all the little white jelly beans I want when you're at work." My skin broke out into pimples, borderline hives, as the words left his mouth. Just then I heard my wife mumbling something with a steady cadence. "Little white jelly beans, little white jelly beans, little white jelly beans." She repeatedly rocked there singing the same song. "Little white jelly beans, little white jelly beans, little white jelly beans." I knew then that my wife could no longer be left alone with my son. I had no choice but to send my wife away to an institution. It was too dangerous to have her near my son, and, well, the help she needed would be given to her around the clock at this mental hospital. She, however, did not go quietly. I told her about the reasoning behind why the men in scrubs were wrapping her in a straitjacket. Her sickly mind could not comprehend the logic. "So you think I'm a bad mother? How dare you? I hope they come for you. I hope they choke you in your sleep. I want you to know that I traded you for them. He can have you, I don't give a fuck." Mary blared out as they carried her off. At the time I thought it was all nonsense, but now I wished her words were some psychotic delusion. The coming days were seemingly calm. I had taken a few days off work to care for my son while I arranged for someone to babysit Tommy. For the most part, I just scrolled through my phone while my son watched cartoons. But everything changed when I saw my son whispering to the wall. The same wall my wife had prayed to for weeks on end. I shot to my feet in a slight panic. "Buddy, what are you doing?" I called out, but he didn't answer. He just kept talking to the wall in a hushed tone. I took to my feet and slowly made my way over to him. When I was inches from him, I could finally hear what he was saying. "Yeah, they're really good," he said with a chuckle. His eyes trained on the wall as if it were speaking to him. He produced a response to a seemingly one-sided conversation. "I don't know if he likes them. I can ask." He looked over his shoulder and posed a question with a grin. "Daddy, do you like jelly beans?" My heart dropped as my gaze crested over his shoulder. In his little hands were palms full of squirmy little maggots. He finally spun around and offered them up to me. I slapped the bugs out of his hands. I grabbed him by the shoulders, trying to force him to answer my questions. "Where did you get these? Where did you find the little jelly beans?" He wiped away tears and pointed at the wall. "The man told me that they were from Grandma and Grandpa." I looked over at the white wall. "What man, Tommy? There is no man," I said, almost trying to convince myself that there wasn't something nefarious happening here. There is a man. He said that he was here to bring Grandma and Grandpa back. He said he promised my mom, but we just had to give him one thing." Tommy paused, thinking of whatever this imaginary man told him. "What? What does this man want?" I commanded with wide eyes while shaking him with impatience. Tommy returned his eyes to me and simply stated, "You." Just then, a shadowy figure lifted its darkened tinge from the wall, disappearing into a dark passageway. I saw it move into my bedroom, but it paused as if it were waiting for me to follow it. Tommy cowered behind my legs. "It's okay, Daddy. The man said we wouldn't be apart for long. He said that all of us would be together again soon." I looked down at Tommy, who bore a hopeful expression. With a grin, he said ecstatically, "The man told me about this place called hell. He said we would all rot together very soon." I don't think he understood. That sounded more like a threat, rather than a message of hope. The shadowy figure disappeared behind the doorframe. "Daddy, what does rot mean?" Tommy questioned, but I didn't answer. "Are you going with him, Daddy? So we can all rot together," he said with mild giddiness. There was no fucking way I was going to follow whatever was waiting for me in the bedroom. Just as I was going to grab Tommy and run out of the house, he darted off towards the bedroom. I tried to make him come back to me, but he quickly dismissed my command as an option. When his little body stood at the entranceway, his eyes filled with wonder. I saw him outstretch his arms and run in for a hug, disappearing into the darkroom. I stood there frozen in fear, but the need to protect my son eventually inched me forward. As my eyes peered around the doorframe, my heart stopped. Silhouetted in the dim moonlight, shining from the window, stood my two deceased in-laws. My little boy clung to his grandmother's leg. However, she did not return the gesture. Instead, she and my father-in-law kept their eyes planted directly on me. I could not get a good look at them, but I could tell that they were not okay. I'd seen them in their caskets a few weeks ago, after all. The shadowy figure stepped into view from behind the recently departed couple. Whatever it was tall, standing high above my in-laws. It outstretched a hand, and as it met the moonlight, I could see that no flesh clung to its person. Rather, the hand was pure ivory. I reached a shaky finger for the light switch. When it clicked on, the shadowy figure vanished. What remained was the horrific sight of my rotting in-laws. In the shine of the bright fluorescent bulb, I saw their skin literally crawling. It wasn't till a few bits of flesh dropped to the floor that I realized the little white jelly beans feasting on their flesh. Tommy looked at the bugs with a twinkle in his eyes. "You see, Daddy, the man wasn't lying. They're back. They're really back," Tommy exclaimed with excitement. Curiosity overtook him, and he picked one of the jelly beans off his grandmother's leg, plopping it into his mouth. At that moment, my mother-in-law's eye fell out of its socket. It dangled there as more jelly beans crawled out from inside her cranial cavity. Tommy caught wind of the spectacle, but instead of retorting in fear, he hopped in place with giddy excitement. He found the dangling eye hilarious. His excitement quickly vanished as something caught the corner of his eye. He looked in my direction, but not at me, at something towering behind me. His little face contorted, as if he were trying to comprehend something. A look of understanding washed across his face before he looked into my eyes. "The man says you have to go with him now." Suddenly, I felt a sudden draft chill the air behind me. From the corner of my eye, a bony hand crept into view. It caressed my shoulder, gripping it with ferocity, almost cracking my bones under the pressure. I forced myself from its grasp, swiveling violently around to see my aggressor. In front of me stood a tall skeleton, cloaked in a black shroud. In its hand was a massive scythe, the blade glistening in the lighting. No matter how bright the fluorescent light was, the two holes where its eyes should be appeared as black as midnight. It outstretched a hand, pleading for me to go with it. I stammered back on my heels, trying to comprehend the situation, but bumped into cold flesh. A few bugs fell on my shirt as the smell of death hit my nose. Over my shoulder stood my burly father-in-law, his eyes devoid of life's spark. I had to get away. I grabbed Tommy, prying his hands away from his grandmother's corpse. We managed to make it to the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind us, though I think it would do little to keep the shadowy figure out. We now sit here waiting for daytime, though Tommy informs me that I belong to the man now, no matter what I do. I'm asking for help. What do I do? I'm pretty sure that my wife's made a deal with death. I'm screwed.